As time goes on and more video game consoles eventually release, it can be a bit difficult to play older games. Backwards compatibility is a nice convenience, but also one that isn't guaranteed. If a platform holder decides to not natively support software for legacy platforms on their new shiny box, well, you're kind of out of luck if you hadn't held on to those older consoles. This is where compilations, ports, and remasters come in. These are a great way to keep older games, be they beloved classics or obscure offshoots, in public circulation and more easily purchasable. In a lot of cases, these releases usually have some extra stuff to sweeten the deal, mostly performance enhancements, quality of life changes, or maybe even online multiplayer if it wasn't in its original release. Sometimes though, some companies will go above and beyond to add to a re-release's value proposition and add some substantial new content, be it new levels, new bosses, or hell, even new characters. One series that has been consistently doing this to varying degrees of success over the last few decades is Sonic the Hedgehog. Hate him or love him, Sega's mostly done a pretty decent job of keeping the 2D games in particular in circulation. Mostly anyway. One of the first and most unique examples I can think of in regards to this trend came with the release of Sonic & Knuckles, which famously allowed you to connect your Sonic 3 cartridge, allowing you to play through Sonic 3 as it was originally intended to be played, before McDonald's licensing deal obligations forced Sega to rush the game out early. More interesting here is how Sonic & Knuckles interacts with Sonic 2. Connecting it to Sonic & Knuckles allowed you to play through the entirety of Sonic 2 as Knuckles, notable in that Sonic 2 released well before Knuckles had even been created. This was due in part to how the Sonic & Knuckles cartridge worked. Outside of the Sonic & Knuckles data, the cartridge also contained a new ROM build of Sonic 2 tweaked to include Knuckles-specific data. When locked on the Sonic 2, the Sonic & Knuckles cartridge pulls level, graphics, and sound data from the Sonic 2 cartridge, but runs the rest off the special version of it in the Sonic & Knuckles cartridge. I've always found it neat, and it's a trend that continues to this day with the series, from Sonic Jam backporting Sonic 2 Spin Dash into Sonic 1, to Sonic Origins having all three main Sonic leads, plus Amy playable in every 16-bit Sonic title, with backported editions like the Drop Dash from Sonic Mania. I've always found these instances interesting, because a new character in a game, or a new set of levels, or even a new difficulty can completely change up the dynamic of a game in ways that might not have been possible in the previous release. Some games even have fun with it, and have new story-based stuff to go with it, one of my favorites being the Game Boy Advance port of Final Fight. You can unlock the Street Fighter Alpha incarnations of Cody and Guy as playable characters, and on top of completely breaking the game, they actually have story paths in the game that frames their playthrough as their Alpha Series versions, reliving and recollecting the events of Final Fight 1. Even though fighting games see re-releases on a fairly regular basis, this kind of thing doesn't happen as often in the genre, and it's for pretty understandable reasons. Fighting game re-releases, perhaps more so than any other genre, almost seem to laser focus on preserving the original games as they were initially released. Considering fighting games in particular hail from a culture where even just having an arcade fighter ported to home consoles with as little compromise as possible was highly valued, I get the approach. When it comes to fighters, we generally get the usual suite of online multiplayer, maybe replay saving, maybe a gallery, and if the game lacked one before, maybe a training mode. There's honestly a decent number of 90s fighting games out there that have never had a release with a proper training mode. However, that still hasn't stopped some companies from indulging every now and then and going out of their way to stick a new playable character in a re-release of a previous fighting game. It's not something that happens often, but it's usually really cool when it does happen. Before we get started talking about the handful of games that do this, one quick thing. For the sake of keeping this list interesting, I'm not going to count instances where fighting game re-releases make previously unplayable bosses selectable in the same game. Sure, they're technically newly playable, but they're not new to the game itself. If the character in question was included in a re-release of a game that predates the game they were initially designed for, that's good enough for me. What I am going to do though is focus on the most interesting instances of this happening. If there's one I omit, just assume I either wasn't aware of it or didn't find it interesting enough to talk about here. All that said, let's begin. I'll say right off the bat that Capcom is a company that's dabbled into this a few times over the years, some examples being more notable than others. Street Fighter Alpha 3 is a really interesting case, as even with the series taking something of a hiatus, Alpha 3 was still being actively updated every now and then during that time frame, most notably adding Maki, Eagle, and Yun to the Game Boy Advance release of Alpha 3, using scaled-down versions of their Capcom vs. SNK 2 sprites. After that release in 2002 though, things were kind of quiet. At least until Alpha 3's final update dropped on the PSP of all things, Street Fighter Alpha 3 Max, or Double Upper in Japan. All console exclusive characters that appeared in previous ports of the game are available in Max, including the aforementioned GBA exclusives, now full on using their CVS2 sprites instead of downscaled versions. The most notable addition, though, was the inclusion of Ingrid, a character that actually debuted in Capcom Fighting Evolution, which released in the time between Alpha 3's last two updates. Look, I know a lot of people out there don't like Ingrid much, but a new character is a new character, especially in a game that hadn't been touched for going on 4 years at that point. Still though, I find her to be a pretty fun addition, and it's not like anything beyond vanilla Alpha 3 is played competitively anyway. Sadly though, Alpha 3 Max's biggest failing is that to this day, it's stuck on PSP and Vita via digital backwards compatibility. I guess there's a chance it could get a release on PS4 and PS5 through Sony's Classics initiative, but it still lacks online play or multiplayer of any kind really, because of how PSP emulation works on those platforms. You'd think that maybe a lesson would have been learned by Capcom here, but they'd go on to do something similar with the release of Power Stone Collection, also a PSP exclusive. Releasing a game known for its local multiplayer on a handheld device without any kind of online multiplayer built in seems kind of counterproductive, but hey, I'm just some dude and they're a corporation. Maybe they know something I don't. That said, the Power Stone Collection is actually a really good port for what it is. You can play both games in their original 4x3 mode, or a new widescreen mode tailor-made for the PSP's aspect ratio. And it's not the really ugly fake widescreen achieved by stretching that you see in other releases, but actual native widescreen capability. It looks nice. But what's really cool is some of the features added to both games. Some of the exclusive items from Power Stone 1 can be unlocked and used in Power Stone 2 and vice versa. This doesn't just apply to items though. The boss characters from Power Stone 1, who were initially absent from the original release of the sequel, can now be unlocked in Power Stone 2. More interestingly though, the new characters that debuted in Power Stone 2 can also be unlocked for play in Power Stone 1 as well. This one's kind of a bigger deal, because both games have a decidedly different cadence. See, Power Stone 1 is a slower, relatively more contained 1v1 fighter, whereas Power Stone 2 has a bunch of backward stage transitions and mini-games that make any given match hectic, on top of supporting 4-player rumbles. Power Stone Collection is pretty much the only place where you'll be able to use the Power Stone 2 characters in a more relaxed game, so to speak, so it's really cool that they added that. Unfortunately, like Alpha 3 Max, Power Stone Collection is likely going to end up as one of those handheld fighting game ports doomed to obscurity because of being locked to the one platform it initially released on. A reworked version of this specific port with local and online multiplayer would straight up be the best version of the game, but hey, at least the arcade versions are in Capcom Fighting Collection 2 with rollback, and I'm happy enough with that. We're not done with Capcom examples just yet though. In the mid-2000s, a group of programmers, artists, and designers from Capcom's arcade era would come together and start an internal initiative of releasing game compilations focused on Capcom's arcade output. These ranged from the honestly surprisingly feature-heavy Street Fighter Alpha anthology to a Japanese PS3 exclusive port of the Dungeons & Dragons arcade beat-em-ups. This team still largely exists today, their most recent works having been the Capcom Beat-em-up bundle and the 3 Capcom Fighting collections, including the aforementioned Fighting Collection 2. That said, their first release isn't as well known, and that's because the collection itself never left Japan. The collection I speak of is of course Vampire Darkstalkers collection. The first of a handful of Darkstalkers compilation re-releases, Vampire Collection includes the 3 mainline games, Darkstalkers, Night Warriors Darkstalkers Revenge or Vampire Hunter as it's known in Japan, and Vampire Savior, as well as the 2 offshoot versions of Savior, Vampire Savior 2 and Vampire Hunter 2. Savior 2 and Hunter 2 existed as a way to include characters from Hunter and Savior while getting around the CPS2 ROM size limit. Darkstalkers characters have a ton of frames of animation, and that put the game pretty much at capacity file size wise. They make some gameplay changes as well, most of which aren't really all that well received by VSAV diehards. However, the PS2 compilation adds in unlockable arranged versions of these games as well. All of the console exclusive characters from Hunter are available in all 3 arranged versions, with Savior in particular now more or less resembling the expanded roster of the previous home ports on Saturn and PS1. However, these arranged versions also contain an entirely new character made for this collection, D. D is supposed to be a representation of how Donovan would end up if he ended up giving in completely to his inner darkness, something hinted at but never really canonically expanded on in his Vampire Hunter ending. He was actually planned at one point to be an alternate playable variant of Dimitri in Vampire Savior, but the idea was initially scrapped. Visually, He's kind of like a Mugen character edit, and I mean that lovingly, not as an insult. He's essentially a recolored Dimitri, only with a modified version of Donovan's head. This is also reflected in his moveset. A lot of his normals come from Dimitri, but his specials, EX moves, and Dark Force are primarily derived from Donovan. His ending also features an older version of Anita as well, and again, while it's up in the air whether or not anything involving D is canon, and I personally kinda doubt it, I do still think when taken at face value as a what-if scenario, it's pretty cool. Is it a reason to rush out and import a copy today? Not really, though the game is pretty affordable these days. Just be aware that this compilation has some noticeable input lag that the following Street Fighter Alpha compilation doesn't have if you want to play it locally. It probably goes without saying that for a lot of people, Street Fighter 2 is the fighting game of all time. It's instantly recognizable, either thanks to its cast or its increasingly expansive list of re-releases and updates over the years. For the longest time, it seemed like HD Remix, released for the Xbox 360 and PS3, would be the very final version of the game. But Capcom shocked, or more so baffled people, when at the Nintendo Switch reveal presentation, they announced Ultra Street Fighter 2: The Final Challengers. What makes Final Challengers interesting is that it's not merely just another Street Fighter 2 port. It's a full title update to Street Fighter 2, the first substantial one since Super Turbo 30 years ago. There's new features like Color Edit showing up for the first time in a Capcom game since 2013, as well as actual mechanical updates like being able to completely break throws in a way more in line with modern games, whereas you could only soften them in Super Turbo. There's also a really weird first-person motion-controlled minigame in here using the Joy-Cons using what seems to be Street Fighter 4 and 5 assets. I've talked about it in an older video if you're interested in learning more about that. But the most obvious addition to the game are the Final Challengers, the first new characters added to Street Fighter 2 in over 2 decades, not counting Shin Akuma and Turbo Revival on Game Boy Advance. This is something Capcom themselves thought was a big selling point, since it's even pointed out in the back of the box as well. Granted, they're not 100% new. They're Evil Ryu and Violent Ken, both palette swaps of Ryu and Ken that debuted in Street Fighter Alpha 2 and SNK vs Capcom SVC Chaos respectively. They're both pretty busted, and honestly, I probably wouldn't have it any other way. Evil Ryu is pretty much what you'd expect. He's Ryu with teleports, stupid damage, raging demon, and a tan. Violent Ken is the marginally more interesting inclusion, primarily for the addition of Resetsu Kyaku, his command teleport from SNK vs Capcom SVC Chaos. I mean, Super Turbo already had a bunch of busted stuff, but an advancing teleport that allows for pressure and mix-ups seems kind of OD for humble Street Fighter 2. Are they the most exciting characters they could have added? Not in the slightest, but let's be real. New characters in Street Fighter 2, 30 years after the fact. That's just kind of insane in and of itself. You know, it's kind of bonkers to me that Sonic the Fighters has only in the last couple years started getting its due, thanks to people fighting back against the narrative of it being a bad fighting game. Like, it's a fighting game made by one of the greatest development studios of all time, and people were instantly willing to dumpster it because it was Sonic related, and game journals and the people that read them weren't willing to engage with the game beyond the basic surface level. Just actual insanity. Thankfully, folks have started exploring the game more, and several great videos about its recent surge in respect and popularity are out there to consume, my personal favorite being Wusstunes' video on its competitive history. One point emphasized in that video is how the players involved ended up getting into the game. For a while, the game was largely an arcade exclusive, but in the mid-2000s, Sega dropped the Sonic Gems collection, a unique Sonic compilation featuring the odds and ends of the series, and one of the marquee games was Sonic the Fighters. I know Gems Collection was definitely my first foray into the game, even if it wasn't perfect. There's a bit of input lag in this port specifically, but when it's all you have, it works in a pinch. A few years later in the early 2010s, Sega would start an initiative on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360's digital marketplaces, the Sega Model 2 collection. These were largely arcade perfect, or at least close to it, ports of various games from Sega's arcade back catalog that ran on Sega's legendary Model 2 hardware. This included the likes of Fighting Vipers, Virtua Fighter 2, and, surprisingly, Sonic the Fighters. These games all featured online multiplayer for the first time as well, a valuable feature for any fighting game re-release. However, because these ports were handled by Sega AM2 themselves, the original development studio behind the vast majority of these arcade fighters, it afforded them some extra flexibility when it came to porting these games. This is probably a good point to mention how Sonic the Fighters came to be in the first place. I mentioned Fighting Vipers earlier, and as it turned out, that game is somewhat intertwined with Sonic the Fighters in a lot of ways. A Sega AM2 programmer, finding himself bored during development of Fighting Vipers, implemented Sonic, Tails, and a few other joke characters thought to be send-ups of Sega staff into the game, though they're not playable without hacking. Sega AM2 and general video game development legend Yu Suzuki caught wind of this, and thought it was a fun enough idea that he went to Sonic team head Yuji Naka and proposed the idea of a Sonic arcade fighter, who after some initial reservations actually went along with the idea. The game, unfortunately, was kind of a flop, and the game had just about zero presence internationally on top of that. Hidden in the code of the game, however, was an unfinished character, and one that brings the Fighting Vipers connection full circle: Honey the cat. Honey was fittingly designed by Masahiro Sugiyama, the character designer for both Fighting Vipers and Sonic the Fighters. She was initially a test character for Sonic the Fighters, being themed after the character of the same name in Fighting Vipers, since that game led to Fighter's conception. Honey in Fighting Vipers features a lot of cat-themed animations and mannerisms in their moveset, and it was that aspect of the character that inspired the decision to design an anthropomorphic cat version of the character for Sonic the Fighters. Her data, while unused, was left over in the arcade and gems collection builds of the game, though her character model was scrubbed entirely from the latter. She's playable via hacking though, where it was shown that she has moves taken from across the entire cast, likely because of her origin as a test model. So back to that 2012 HD port. In addition to online multiplayer, this new release of Sonic the Fighters also enabled the use of the boss characters Metal Sonic and Eggman in local multiplayer. Both don't really see competitive play due to being pretty busted, but they're still a blast to mess around with every now and then on your own. Most notably though, is that 16 years after the game's original arcade debut, Sega AM2 took the leftover data they had for her in-game and actually put the work in to complete her, implementing her as a secret character accessible by highlighting Amy on the character select screen and pressing start. Her moveset is changed up from the arcade data mine, now largely having a moveset based on Knuckles with a bit of Amy thrown in. She also has a proper versus portrait now as well, though she's still only in silhouette. She's also the only character in the game with a distinct Player 2 costume, an outfit that actually appears in the opening sequence for the Saturn version of Fighting Vipers. I think it's incredibly cool that Sega AM2 saw an opportunity to do something cool here with what would have otherwise been lost content and actually made something of it. I would have probably bought the game already given the online, but seeing Honey in the game made me want to buy it as soon as it dropped. Not only is it neat as a player, but it's also a really cool piece of Sega history finally coming full circle, and I'm all about that. While this port is largely still only on PS3 and 360 with netplay intact, a port of the game based on this specific version is available on Lost Judgment and still has Honey available, so if you're a weirdo like me that values having a physical copy of this in a roundabout way, be sure to pick that up sometime. Honey is the most interesting character in this video to me, not just because of the circumstances that led to her eventual implementation, but she's also notably one of the few characters who actually does see competitive play in her respective game and is an established part of its meta now. She's a shining example of the idea that little additions like this don't just have to end up as obscure footnotes in fighting game history relegated to a section in the video of a washed up YouTube dork. They can absolutely help shape their game as well. It just needs a scene. Dead or Alive has been associated with Xbox platforms for the vast majority of its lifespan, and its run on the original Xbox is my personal favorite stretch of the series. Dead or Alive 3 was a launch title for the original Xbox, and just a genuinely stunning game, even to this day. It seems like a quantum leap over Dead or Alive 2, which had only released 2 years prior, and even that was a massive step up from Dead or Alive 1. Realizing they had a golden opportunity here, Tecmo took the liberty of bringing Dead or Alive 1 and 2 forward to Xbox as part of a compilation, Dead or Alive Ultimate. This contained Dead or Alive 1 Ultimate, a port of the Sega Saturn port of the game running at a higher resolution and marking the first time that version has been available outside of Japan, and more notably, Dead or Alive 2 Ultimate, a remake of DOA 2 running on DOA 3's engine, bringing the game visually and mechanically in line with 3. It's honestly one of the best packages in the entire series, along with DOA 5 Last Round and Dead or Alive Dimensions. Just utterly mind-blowing stuff for 2004, and like DOA 3, Ultimate still holds up visually. Being on the same engine though, Tecmo also took the opportunity to throw in a little bonus for players that also own Dead or Alive 3. If you have a Dead or Alive 3 save on your Xbox, boot up Dead or Alive 2 Ultimate and beat Hayate's story mode, and after seeing his ending, you'll be rewarded with a brand new character backported into 2 Ultimate from 3, Hitomi. She can't be played in story mode, but she's playable in every other mode like time attack and survival mode. Because 2 Ultimates already updated its hold system to match 3s, Hitomi fit into the game pretty smoothly. Even funnier, Hitomi actually has more costumes in DOA 2 Ultimate than she does in her debut game. DOA 3 has about 5 to 6 costumes per character, but DOA 2 has about 20, and surprisingly, that extends to Hitomi as well. Fighting game characters officially being implemented in fighting games they weren't originally in before is already a rare thing, but a character doing so, and arguably being treated even better in comparison in said game, is even more astronomically rare. Though both games only ever released on the original Xbox, the discs are backwards compatible on current Xbox platforms, and if you buy the digital version specifically, Hitomi is already unlocked in DOA 2 Ultimate. Give it a try if you have the means. One of my favorite traditions in SNK fighters is the concept of a dream match. These are essentially games with no canonical relevance whatsoever that firmly exist to allow characters that had been in games in that series up to that point to exist in the same game just for the sake of having as many characters as possible. Fatal Fury did this with Fatal Fury Special and Real Bout Special. Samurai Showdown did it with 6 in the updated versions of 5, and the King of Fighters has done it multiple times. The first one for KOF, and still a pretty beloved title overall, was King of Fighters 98, capping off the Orochi saga with a who's who of roster choices from a good chunk of characters that had been in the series up to that point. 10 years after its original release, SNK would release an update to KOF 98 titled The King of Fighters 98 Ultimate Match. This included everyone from 98, along with other characters in the Orochi saga that missed out on Vanilla 98, like Eiji and Geese. Shortly thereafter, the second Dream Match game in the series and the other beloved classic KOF game, The King of Fighters 2002, would see a similar update titled Unlimited Match, similarly encompassing nearly everyone playable through the series' second main story arc, the Nest Saga. Unlimited Match does, however, have one brand new character added to the roster that hadn't appeared in any game prior. Well, brand new with an asterisk anyway. But before we talk about him, we should probably talk about a certain other character from the Nest Saga though. Meet K49. He debuted in KOF 2001 as a part of the Nest team, and, well, for lack of a better way of explaining it, he's basically a ripoff of Tetsuo from Akira, down to his moves being blatant references and even sharing the same voice actor. Homages are nothing new to SNK. Benimaru is a walking, talking shoutout to a whole bunch of foundational anime, but K49 is probably the most blatant example of it in the series. After KOF 2002, he'd all but disappear from the mainline games, only having minor cameos. SNK's always played pretty coy about why this was the case. Were they afraid of being sued? Had they already been threatened with a lawsuit? Or were they just having fun with it and committing to the bit? This all came to a head in 2002 Unlimited Match, where almost everyone from the Nest Saga games came back. Everyone, that is, except for K49. But Unlimited Match's biggest claim to fame was the addition of a completely new character, Nameless. Nameless is a clone of Nest Saga protagonist K-Dash. Not a moveset clone of him though. If you've ever played KOF 99 through 2001, there's a lot of cloning that goes on in the plot of those games. Just ask Kia. Speaking of, while Nameless is cloned from K-Dash, he, like K49, is also infused with Kyo's DNA as well, giving him power over flames, though neither character can control them to the extent Kyo can. One of the key design concepts for Nameless was that of a ninja, sporting a dark outfit with a really tattered, really cool looking scarf. It's when you start playing as Nameless though that you start seeing what his primary function is. He's basically the K49 function. No, seriously, his entire moveset is more or less a match for K49's, give or take a few normals. Some moves have an aesthetic change, like his projectile actually having flames, as opposed to the dirt K49 uses, but yeah, take a look. So, does he fare well in high-level play? Well, yes, actually, very much so. Nameless is a top-tier character that absolutely thrives in the anchor position, having incredibly damaging max mode combos in particular that can tear apart an unsuspecting character. After Unlimited Match though, that's pretty much it for Nameless. He popped up in a few KOF mobile games, but being a replacement goldfish for another character, and in an already non-canon Dream Match game at that, meant his days were always numbered. Way later down the line in KOF 15 though, K49 would finally resurface under a new identity, Cronin, sporting longer hair and sunglasses, the change in name and design being attributed to him laying low from the Nest Syndicate, which is a fitting in-universe cover story that explains for why he disappeared from the games for so long. He then went on to completely terrorize KOF 15's meta for a couple years before SNK finally took him out back and shot him in the knees. We've talked about a lot of fighting games so far, but as I was working on this, I wanted to challenge myself by asking, what's the oldest fighting game that got a new character? At first, it looked like Ultra Street Fighter 2 was going to be the winner of that, but my research ended up bearing even more interesting fruit, taking me to a Game Boy Advance port of a game that isn't just older than Street Fighter 2, it's one of the earliest fighting games, period. Karate Champ, developed by Technos Japan, is generally regarded as the progenitor of the one-on-one fighting game, released in May of 1984 in the arcades. In October of that same year though, Konami, obviously inspired by Karate Champ, would throw their own hat into the ring with ER Kung Fu. While Karate Champ laid the very basic groundwork for the idea of a one-on-one combat game, ER Kung Fu established conventions foundational to the genre today, such as health meters, high jumps, and unique characters, even though the computer opponents were unplayable. It'd get quite a few ports to early home computers and consoles over the next few decades, but the most interesting port by far can be found in Konami Collector's Series Arcade Advanced on Game Boy Advance. This is a compilation of Konami's earliest arcade titles, including Russian Attack, Frogger, and Gradius series progenitor Scramble. This collection, in addition to featuring surprisingly accurate arcade ports of these games, also sprinkles each title with new additions, some having entirely new graphics or music that can be toggled, and some games having new head-to-head or co-op modes that weren't in their original release. You unlock these by doing the Konami code because, well, duh, it's Konami. In the case of ER Kung Fu, there's a new multiplayer mode which allows either player to select not just the default player 1 character, Oolong, but every computer opponent that went unplayable in the original release of the game, which is pretty neat. However, I did say previously unplayable CPU opponents becoming playable in later ports of a game don't count for this video, and I stand by that. But ER Kung Fu also has one last trick on Game Boy Advance. Doing that Konami code also unlocks two completely new characters for this versus mode, Bishoo and Clayman. Bishoo is a woman that throws knives, while Clayman is a statue that fights with a sword. ER Kung Fu's gameplay isn't terribly complex, so it's not like a new character changes dynamics up a ton, but it's still very cool that they even bothered adding them. Bishoo specifically seems to be partially inspired by an opponent that can be fought in the MSX version of the game's sequel. I imagine the amount of people an edition like this would have appealed to would be hilariously small, but I think that just adds to how cool it is that Konami even bothered in the first place, even if most people won't see it because it's a multiplayer thing only. Allegedly, there was an early mobile phone port of the game as well, only ever released in Japan, that featured an additional character of its own, a katana-wielding ninja named Katana. I haven't been able to track down this version of the game though, so I can't verify it for myself. Before we end, I do want to give an honorable mention to JoJo's Bizarre Adventure All-Star Battle R, a 2022 update to the 2013 game that notably added in a few new characters that weren't in the original release. What's particularly notable is that many of the new characters more or less reused assets from developer CyberConnect 2's original follow-up to All-Star Battle, Eyes of Heaven, which was notably not a traditional 2D fighting game, but instead their bread and butter, an arena fighter. Pretty smart reuse of assets there. All that said, that's going to do it for this video. If there's any examples that you can think of that isn't noted in the video, do feel free to let me know about it in the comment section. I've had to dig deep for some of the examples in this video, so if there's any more out there, I'd love to know about them. As always, thanks for watching, and a special thanks to the patrons that support the channel. Take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.